Okay, so the artist of Dragon Ball Super, Toyoytarou, recently revealed one of the last requests that the original creator of Dragon Ball, Akira Toriyama, had before his untimely passing. And it's definitely something very interesting because it wasn't just something trivial by any means. It was actually one of the final story ideas that he had for the Dragon Ball Super manga. And we know that at the end of the day, Akira Toriyama was pretty heavily involved in the Dragon Ball Super story. He essentially would create the blueprint and allow Toyoytarou to kind of get from point A to point B, similar to what they do with the Boruto manga. And ultimately, to hear one of the final requests that Akira Toriyama had is something very big and something very important, especially for any and all fans of the Dragon Ball franchise. Now, it's been over a year since the untimely passing of the late great Akira Toriyama, and ultimately since the Dragon Ball Super manga went on hiatus. We recently had the one-shot story that was kind of focusing in again on the hero aspect, but for the most part, outside of Daima, the Dragon Ball Super story in and of itself has been basically at a standstill. Again, we had the one shot, but the story itself hasn't continued on in the grand scheme of things as far as, like, you know, the major aspects. And a lot of that is definitely due to Akira Toriyama's passing, aside from the fact that there was some hiatuses that was happening, I want to say, around that time. But regardless of what, Dragon Ball Super manga really hasn't been moving forward. However, it is interesting to note that in the latest stuff that's been happening with the manga, some of the things in there, Akira Toriyama had a very much so heavy hand in what he wanted to happen in those aspects. And ultimately, it's interesting to note what one of his final requests were for the Dragon Ball Super manga. Let's read. And before we continue, if you would hit that subscribe button and that bell, I'd greatly appreciate it. You get more videos like this. Dragon Ball Super artist reveals major fact about one of Toriyama's last requests. The loss of Akira Toriyama is still being felt in the anime community to this day, as the Dragon Ball creator and his work helped influence so many stories in its wake. Thanks to the release of Dragon Ball Super's 24th manga volume, artist Toyoytarou shared several interesting facts about the chapters that made up this compilation. One of the biggest was one of the final conversations the artist had with his sensei Toriyama and what he had wanted for one of the last stories that he helped to create. Even with Toriyama gone, his influence on the world will be felt for quite some time to come. In a new afterword in Dragon Ball Super Volume 24, Toyoytarou states, "The Saiyaman X origin story that I was able to include at the end of this volume is a manga adaptation with additional details based on a text written by Toriyama sensei. While working on Saiyaman X as a prequel to the superhero arc, sensei shared a story with the note, 'It's up to you whether this gets used in the main story or not. I felt it would be too much of a waste to leave it out, so I wanted to adapt it into a manga.' Toyoytarou then continued after being handed the shonen reins by Akira. However, since the superhero arc's prequel was limited to 3 chapters, I had no choice but to abandon the idea. Instead, I was allowed to draw 3 chapters covering events after the birth of Saiyaman X. As we reached the conclusion of the superhero arc, this was a story I just couldn't leave untold. I was fortunate enough to have my request granted, allowing me to present it as a one-shot. Thank you for reading. With this, the superhero arc is officially complete." So it's definitely very interesting to note that the Saiyaman X whole storyline and the prequel was something that was very much so that Akira Toriyama wanted to be told. He wanted this story of Goten and Trunks to be told. The characters that a lot of people would like to have seen more throughout the Dragon Ball story definitely got their time to shine, and a lot of that is attributed to Toriyama wanting this story to be told. Initially, when we got these chapters, a lot of people were skeptical. Like, at the end of the day, everybody still wanted the Black Frieza stuff to continue and so on and so forth. But to understand that this was one of the final stories that Toriyama wanted to be told makes this arc that much more special, makes this definitely something that at some given point I would love to see animated beautifully as well, because a lot of people say that Daima was the last thing that Toriyama worked on and whatnot, but if this was one of his last story ideas for the Dragon Ball Super story, ultimately this is even more special and definitely something worth at the very least checking out if you haven't already, and definitely worth respect because this is something that Toyoytarou made sure to include as a final tribute to Toriyama. Time to get out.